Now, I know what you might be thinking. A flare gun only, that's gotta be stretching the truth, right? There's some catch. You had some indirect way of killing everything, or you had a modded flare gun that was way better than the one in the base game, and no, there was no catch. It was actually a fair bit more difficult than you might be thinking. To run down exactly what flare gun only means, it means that I can only use a flare gun, obviously, and some indirect methods of killing enemies like lava. I can't use indirect damage intentionally on bosses. If something like a fallen star hits them, that's fine, but I can't set up boulder traps or dart traps to kill bosses for me. I didn't use traps at all, really. Even with regular enemies, the only indirect method I used was lava, and I didn't use it much. I also can't use armor sets, accessories, or potions to deal damage for me. No orichalcum, honeycomb, star cloak, chlorophyte, turtle armor, thorns potions, nothing like that. The character is on journey mode, but the only powers I can use are time control to freeze time for the mech bosses and difficulty adjustment to make the game harder. The baseline is normal difficulty. If mech bosses didn't exist, I would be playing on normal because the wall of flesh can't be killed with a flare gun on any difficulty higher than normal. I just made the game more difficult because normal mode isn't that hard even with only a flare gun. I played almost all the game while not fighting bosses on master mode. I also have to kill the Moonlord, but not optional bosses like the Empress of Light and Duke Fishron. I've killed those two with a flare gun and paper airplanes before, respectively, on master difficulty. I didn't really feel like doing something similar again here. Now, that may not sound so bad on paper, but if you've ever used a flare gun before, you might have realized that it's not exactly a great weapon. I used blue flares, obviously. Doing this with red flares would be a war crime according to Article 8 of the Geneva Conventions. Even still, the flare gun's 3 damage isn't exactly ideal, along with it being completely unable to deal critical hits and being effectively impossible to improve in any way. It does have 2 things going for it though. It lights things on fire, which is great, except when it doesn't, because lots of enemies can't be lit on fire. It also pierces enemies, which is pretty cool. There is one other important thing about the flare gun. Terraria has a built-in limit of 1,000 projectiles that can be in the world at any one time. If you try to spawn more when 1,000 are already in the game, nothing happens. Since flares take 10 minutes to despawn and you shoot them pretty quickly, you can reach that limit with a flare gun. Firing as fast as possible, you hit 1,000 flares in about 6 minutes, and that means you can't keep firing until some of the flares start to despawn. And that's problematic, but I'll get into that later. Now, to start with, I tossed out everything that I owned, disabled the active powers, and cranked the difficulty up to master. Like I said before, journey mode is only to give me a way to pause time and to make the game harder. I don't want all this extra gear. After building a place for the merchant, I needed to find a flare gun. I can't kill anything until I find one, so it's a top priority to get one quickly. And I did. Less than 20 minutes in, and I'm as powerful as I'm going to be for the rest of the game. And with a weapon in hand, it's time to start killing bosses. I start with the Eye of Cthulhu, but I couldn't find a way to deal enough damage to him before morning on master difficulty. He just had too much HP, and I didn't have enough time or ammo. So I moved on to the brain. Despite being 78% water, the brain burns very easily, and without too much trouble I burnt it to a crisp. An arena of several platforms is more than enough to give you room to evade it. I decide to knock out King Slime next, who gives up on life pretty quickly. He's also fairly easy to evade once you've got some mobility. And then it's back to the Eye. This time I'm fighting him on expert mode and I'm giving him all I've got, which is about 1,000 flares. And it's tough. I make every flare count, keeping him on fire constantly and laying into him in his second phase once his defense drops to 0. I'm fighting against the clock and my ammo. I only have about 9.5 minutes of night and, like I said, I only have about 1,000 shots. The Eye has 3,640 HP on expert mode. Even being on fire for 570 seconds, 9.5 minutes, will only deal 2,280 damage. I need to deal almost 1,400 damage just by hitting the Eye with flares. And, with my last shot and 40 seconds to spare, the Eye spies death. Next up is Skeletron and... Oh boy. Skeletron absolutely massacred me. I fought him on master mode and refused to pause time. I needed to kill his hands at night and then essentially fight the dungeon guardian with almost nothing to help me evade it. There was just barely enough time in the night to destroy his hands, and then avoiding the instant death that is daytime Skeletron was a very tough challenge to overcome. I didn't build a hoik, I didn't get gravitation potions, I didn't use a minecart track, I had a blizzard in a balloon, spectre boots, and a ruby hook, and that's it. The fights were incredibly tense. Skeletron needed to be right next to me, and a single wrong key press meant instant death. I don't press spacebar at the right time, instant death. I'm a little slow, instant death. When I reached the edge of my walkway, I needed to jump in the air, grapple the ground, and loop around him. A pretty difficult maneuver to pull off. Failing, instant death. Skeletron killed me far more than any boss during this challenge, but after hours and hours of milk deprivation, his bones finally snapped. And feeling pretty confident after slaying Skeletron, I decided that not only am I going to fight Queen Bee, I'm going to fight her enraged on Master Mode. It was a calculated risk, but boy was my math bad. With no consistent way to dodge her attacks once she sped up past half HP, I was ordered to tanking bees and using iframes to stay alive. Next was the Wall of Flesh. Now, the Wall of Flesh is the only boss I wasn't certain about being able to kill. I found a strategy that worked, but it required a massive amount of preparation. You see, the Wall of Flesh has 3 body parts, and by firing straight upward with all of them above you, you can hit each one with a single shot. But, in order to do this consistently, you need a long, flat walkway across the underworld, and that takes a really long time to build. Especially when you can't kill enemies in the underworld because you're on Master Mode and you have a flare gun. But, after over half a dozen hours, I have my walkway built and I start shredding the Wall of Flesh. It can't be caught on fire, and I need to deal 8,000 damage with 1,000 shots, something seemingly impossible since he only has 3 body parts, 2 that get hit for 3 damage, and 1 that gets hit for 1 damage. That's 7,000 damage assuming each shot hits 3 times. But, because his segments are big, it's possible to hit a section multiple times with a single hit, making this possible. And, with almost all of my ammo gone and at the very edge of my walkway, I deal the final blow and plunge the world into hard mode. Now the real challenge begins. There were a couple of things I needed to avoid doing in hard mode. Firstly, and most importantly, I decided not to break a single Crimson Altar. Doing that would invite pirates to invade my world, and I happen to like not having pirates in my world. It's rather nice and peaceful here. That meant that I couldn't get hard mode ores aside from fishing. It also meant there wasn't much to do before fighting the mech bosses. I did fish a bit in lava, both for money and for ores to make a hard mode anvil and forge, and I mined and sold a bunch of hellstone to finance my journey. Speaking of the mech bosses, they're the reason this character is in journey mode. I needed to pause time to be able to kill them. They took hours and hours to kill something completely impossible to squeeze into 9.5 minutes. First up, I set my sights on a pair of Christmas-colored eyeballs. At first, I decided to do it on Master Mode, and I got very, very close. Around 4 hours in, and Retinazer only had 500 HP left, but a very lovely possessed armor decided that he didn't want Retinazer to die and killed me. That was very nice of him. I didn't really want to kill the twins anyway. It was no big deal though, I just had to do it again, and I had to do it better this time. I went down to expert mode and handily kicked their asses, flying up and down to evade Spasmatism, knowing that Retinazer's inaccurate shots were unlikely to hit me. With Spasmatism's second phase, I started baiting around his dashes and using a grappling hook to get some distance. Things were going pretty well, that is, until both of them were in their second phases at the same time. I had another 1,000 damage to deal at Spasmatism, and they were both laying into me. I was still using Crimson armor, I couldn't afford to take many hits. Even still, with the help of the nurse, I evaded death and smashed the eyes to pieces. The Destroyer came next, still on expert mode, and oh dear. There's an interesting fact about the Destroyer and the probes. The probes don't release based on how much damage you deal, just on whether or not you hit the segment they're stored in. They also don't despawn. With a weapon that pierces infinitely and does next to no damage, that's a recipe for a lovely appetizer of dozens of probes before the main course of Worm. But, with the help of a teleporter, I finished off the probes and started pecking at the big metal worm. He can't be caught on fire, but he does have a lot of body parts. It's possible to get over 100 DPS against the Destroyer. And with the probes gone, he doesn't pose too much of a threat, and I take him out after nearly a 5-hour-long fight. The last of the Triumvirate is Julius Skeletron, and our showdown is on Master Mode. He's not too bad on his own, but the wyverns that kept showing up were making the fight a real mess. I decided to make a few pieces of hollowed armor for extra defense. I was still using Crimson at this point, and that extra protection lets me comfortably take him out. I technically didn't have to pause time for this fight, but felt it would be pretty boring to fight him in his Enrage mode. To stop wyverns from showing up, I took a few suspicious eyes out and summoned the Eye of Cthulhu. With 2 bosses in the world, other enemies almost completely stopped spawning. At this point, Plantera and Golem are the only things standing between me and the endgame. I dive straight in, building a massive arena to fight them in. I forgot my Weed Whacker, but Plantera burns easily enough. She is a plant after all. Even on expert mode, she was the easiest of the hard mode bosses. She took the least time to kill at only about 2.5 hours. There was a small problem though. The arena I built was too big. There was a small area in the middle that didn't count as the jungle anymore, causing her to become enraged and very nearly killing me. It seems that the damage of her attacks is based on whether or not she's enraged when she fires them, not whether or not she's enraged when they hit you. That means that I would randomly get hit for over 100 damage by spiky balls in her first phase. She would shoot them while enraged and they would bounce around for a while afterwards. But, with a good amount of space and wings that can carry you in a circle around her, Plantera isn't too tough to kill, just be fast and keep your distance in phase 2. It might seem strange, but Golem was one of the worst bosses that I had to fight, and that comes down solely to the fact that he cannot be caught on fire. It took almost 9 hours to kill him on expert mode. I was slowly going insane during this fight. At the beginning, I was reading off some of H.P. Lovecraft's stories and entries from the Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition rulebooks, barely even looking at the screen. After I finished up phase 1, I took a quick break before moving on to his last phase. There's not a lot to this fight. Go in a semicircle around him and shoot flares. I did lead him out of the temple and into Plantera's arena, which made it a bit easier, although he did get enraged briefly and very nearly killed me. At this point, it's worth talking about how to fight bosses with low damage weapons. It's all about staying alive. You don't need to deal good damage to defeat a boss, you just need to not die. If you don't die, if you deal at least 1 damage per hit, there's no time limit, and the boss doesn't heal, then any boss is possible. High defense, damage reduction buffs, regeneration through campfires, outlanterns, and potions, all of those are pretty important in staying alive. On top of that, you need to be good at dodging. The defense and regeneration are to minimize how much making a mistake hurts you. They won't carry you through difficult fights on their own, especially on higher difficulties. It's inevitable that you're going to make a mistake eventually. It's important that the mistake isn't crippling. Having a good understanding of how to dodge a boss's attacks is very important. Knowing what and when they'll do something and how to dodge is necessary for how the bosses take the Moonlord. You need to know how to dodge his attacks and also when and how to dodge his healing for him to be possible. The worst boss in the game is next. The Lunatic Cultist is the only boss that I did off stream, and I decided to fight him on normal mode after dying halfway through on expert mode. For reasons that make perfect sense, the man wearing robes cannot be caught on fire. His attacks are simple enough and not particularly dangerous, but if he manages to summon a phantasm dragon, the fight very quickly changes. It requires a lot of focus to make sure you don't accidentally hit a clone and summon one, and phantasm dragons are much faster and more agile than wyverns, along with having much more HP and not being able to be caught on fire. He managed to summon a single one, along with an ancient vision, and that dragon very nearly killed me, and that was the successful attempt. On the previous attempts, the dragon did kill me, along with the fact that blood moons and solar eclipses could happen during this fight because I was above ground with time not paused. The Lunatic Cultist, thankfully, has a pretty simple cycle of attacks: fire, ice, lightning, fire, ice, summon in his first phase. His summon location is also based on where you are. As far as I can tell, he never uses the bottom left area, and he goes to the right if you're on his left, and at the top if you're on his right. But with beetle armor and warding accessories, his attacks deal very little damage if they do hit me, and I just had to very slowly kill him with 1 damage hits. The pillars proved to be rather interesting. I indirectly killed the waves of enemies using lava, which was actually a pretty effective way of getting through it. By essentially suiciding in a pool of lava and throwing the enemies inside, I got through most of the pillars without much issue. Setting my spawn next to the lava and jumping in was a really good way of knocking out the shields. And then, after knocking out all the shields, I saved and quit and realized that the shields reset. Oops. So I had to do it all again. Killing the actual pillars was time consuming, but not difficult. I stood very high up in the air and fired downward, dealing 20,000 damage after about 2 hours each. Because I enjoy having my fingers not be in pain, I rebound the attack key. At first, I used L because I didn't think L was bound to anything. Turns out L was bound to toggle journey mode powers, and that made it impossible to rebind or even save and quit the game, because if you press escape, and you go to the menu and you press L, it'll take you out of the menu and into your inventory, and it's impossible to do anything. So I had to Alt F4 to quit the game, and that didn't save my progress, so I had to do the Vortex Pillar a 3rd time. Learning my lesson from that, I rebound attacked to Alt and took out the remaining pillars. And then I had to face the final and most intimidating challenge, the Moonlord. Not only does he have far more HP than any other boss in the game, he also has a self-heal mechanic, one that is very difficult to avoid. He can, thankfully, be caught on fire, but I needed to find a way to stop his healing before I could even think about killing him. The Moonlord's heal is tied to the Moonbite debuff, which he inflicts with his tongue. If you have the debuff, the tongue will send back leeches with 400 HP each that heal him for 1,000. Normally, this isn't a problem. The leeches are very easy to kill, and 1,000 damage is easy to inflict again anyway. But these are not normal circumstances. I knew of 2 strategies for stopping his healing, but neither of them would work here. The Celestial Starboard is fast enough to outfly his tongue, and the Nurse can heal the debuff, but the Starboard requires killing the Moonlord first, and the Nurse is far too expensive at 1.4, it would cost like 20 something gold per heal. But I had hoped for something else. The tongue doesn't teleport with the Moonlord. That means teleporting away from the Moonlord when his tongue is out should get me away from the tongue. But I don't just need something that works theoretically, I need something that works with near-perfect consistency. At first, I built a long arena with a teleporter at either end, running back and forth when he sent out his tongue. But, while it worked sometimes, it was just too inconsistent to reliably stop his healing. I repositioned the teleporters a bit, and instead I started using the magic mirror. When his tongue would come out, I'd fly up, recall back, and dodge it. This ended up being very consistent, enough for me to whittle him down past phase 1 and into the 2nd. At this point, things got a lot more difficult. Not only are the True Eyes very difficult to dodge, but his healing occurs much more frequently. I used a similar strategy to phase 1, recalling and teleporting back, but it was still very rough. I did find something else though. Very quickly spamming teleports will stop him from healing. It seems to cause the moon leeches to despawn and never make it back to him. That gave me a consistent last resort. Even if his tongue does hit me, I can spam teleports to stop his healing. With that, I had everything I needed to finish this fight. I whittled him down to nothing, taking over 10 hours to kill him. And now, it was time to celebrate. The skies were filled with demon eyes and wyverns coming to my party, and my struggle of 110 hours, 4 minutes, and 12 seconds was over. I streamed most of this challenge on Twitch over the past 2 months. The VODs are all still up, at least at the time of recording this, although I did a lot of boring stuff off stream, mining, fishing, farming, building arenas, stuff like that. I haven't really decided what I want to do next. I'd rather not just do another beat game with bad weapon challenge, because once you've done one, you've pretty much done them all. If you have any ideas, feel free to leave a comment. I'll also link a playlist with most of the boss fights for this edited down to a few minutes in the description. For now though, I'll leave this video to my gecko.